Hello everyone. I'm very glad to meet you all. This session is about theory and method of privatization, and I will introduce myself briefly. I'm an economist and started my career in KDI, and I've been with KDI for now 29 years. And I had 3 absences of leave. The first one was as a director for administrative reform team under Ministry of Planning and Budget. My job was to manage SOE and privatize them. And I was executive director for Research Center for State-Owned Enterprise. And I also was a president for National Assembly Futures Institute until 2020. Okay, these are the contents of today's topic. The fundamental question that I would like to raise to you is this: to provide a better service and goods to the people with less cost, who should be the supplier? Is it the government or the private company? Private company in general is much more efficient than the state-owned enterprise. But state-owned enterprise has many problems, and those problems comes from these 5 collusions that they have. The first collusion is between SOE and politicians. SOE gets reappointment from the politicians, and instead they provide political money to politicians. And SOE wants to have a good working relations with labor union, and therefore they provide good payments and fringe benefit to staffs of the labor union and the SOEs. And also SOE wants to have more revenue from the private sector, and they also want to have more investment projects to increase their influence and their positions. They need help from the government, and instead SOE provide job after retirement and economic boost for the government. Finally, even the citizen is a part of this collusion. The SOE provide low rate, and this low rate is an excuse of no privatization, and citizens enjoy this low rate. So politicians, labor union, government, and citizens are all part of collusion with SOE, and that's why SOE has many problems. And instead, general citizens and taxpayers and future generations are a victim of this collusion. And as a result, SOE has many problems. First, they are very inefficient. So if we privatize SOE, we have a firm level the benefit of privatization. And SOE blocks the new entry to the market, so it's not good for the competition in the market. So if we privatize SOE, we can enjoy market level benefit of privatization. And third, SOE is influenced by the politics, and so the many decisions of SOEs in that respect are not logical and not economically efficient. And also SOE worsens corruption. So when we privatize SOE, we can overcome this problem. That's a state level benefit of privatization. Of course, privatization is not a solution for all the problems that you have, but it can open a door for better performance and more efficiency. Why privatization can reduce corruption? Corruption is a problem of many or all developing countries, but privatization can reduce the corruption. Well, state-owned enterprise has a bilateral relations with politics. Okay, they have a good influence from the politics. Instead, they provide bribe to the politics. But when we privatize SOE, we have government and business separated. Okay? If government and business are separated, we have triangle network rather than bilateral. In this triangle, after the privatization, the politics influence the government, and the government provide some special favor, and instead the private business provide bribe to the politics. And in this process, this special favor is often observable by outsiders, news media, or the competitor in the market. They can observe this special favor. So that's why the government may have to may try to avoid the corruption in order not to be spotted in the corruption behavior. And privatization also entails competition, and competition is a very effective medicine for corruption. Because when you have this triangle, when government offer a special favor to the private company, other competitor will complain about this special favor. For instance, if Korean government offer a special favor only to Samsung Electronics, LG Electronics will be angry about this bias of the government. So government has to be neutral because they are afraid of these other competitors, careful observation on this triangle deal. So that's why privatization and the competition reduces corruption of a country. But there are people who believe that we still need the state-owned enterprise. Yes, there are many reasons why we still have to maintain SOEs. One of the reasons is lack of a private sector. When the private sectors are too small to take a risk in industry like steel and energy, then maybe you will have to resort to SOE. But as the economy develops, private company can utilize foreign capital, and they overcome this lack of capital issue. Sometimes there is a public mission that is not profitable, such as housing for the poor. Yes, this is not profitable, but it's very important for the country. But it doesn't have to be supplied by SOE all the time. Sometimes you can invite private company and subsidize them so that they can supply housing for the poor. Third, sometimes government wants to raise revenue. However, government's revenue should come from tax money, not from SOE. Okay? So you will have to facilitate the private sector and levy a tax on them. That should be the source of government revenue. And finally, you may want to avoid private monopoly. When you have a network industry, such as telecommunication or railway, these industries has very big economies of scale. In other words, if you become bigger, then you become more efficient. So if you bring competition, then market share for each company will be very small. In that case, you cannot take advantage of economies of scale. You will be very inefficient. So in this network industry, in order to enjoy economies of scale, you will have to be big. When you are big and when you are the only supplier in the market, that's why we say natural monopolist. If you privatize natural monopolist, you will have private monopolist. But private monopolist is very, very bad. The public monopolist is better than private monopolist. So in that case, you will have to maintain state-owned enterprise when it is a monopolist. However, when economies develops, the market can grow. If a market becomes big enough, when you separate those markets, you can still maintain economies of scale. Okay? In that case, you can bring competition. So it depends on the size of the market. If your market is big enough, you can still bring competition in this network industry. Okay? So at the beginning of your economic development, these reasons, rationales for maintaining SOE is acceptable, but as the economy develops, these rationales becomes weaker, and the privatization rationale becomes much more stronger. Of course, I'm not saying that we have to privatize all SOEs. We need SOEs for the following reasons. Natural monopoly, when your market is not big enough, or government's legal authority, like real estate development, or inspection or identification, or national security issue, such as minting and printing your money, or oil reserve, or promotion agencies, or public use of high monopolistic profits, such as horse racing, or high contract cost, or high adjustment cost for changing the supplier. In these cases, it's better to maintain state-owned enterprise and see if whether your SOEs will have to be owned by the government. But the burden of proof not to be privatized is on SOE. You will have to ask each SOE to defend themselves. If they cannot defend themselves, all SOE have to be privatized. Okay? I talked about the six different supplier of government's goods or services. Certain services can be supplied by government corporation in a ministry, or it can be supplied by private company. Okay? In the middle, there are many different forms of suppliers. So your SOE is just one of them. Okay? Your profit generating function can be a government corporation or autonomous administration or executive agencies or quasi-government organizations. So they have differences, and it's better to move from this ministry towards this side. Okay? I will introduce the differences very briefly. First of all, if you move from ministry to autonomous administration, you separate the organization. Okay? Profit generating function should be separated from the ministry as an autonomous administration. And you give more autonomy and more flexibility, then it becomes executive agency. Okay? But until this executive agency, it is still civil servant organization. But this quasi-government organization is a private sector, but their budget comes from the government. They might have some their revenue from the market, but it's very minor. Mostly they rely on government budget. And this state-owned enterprise is a corporation. So when you corporatized your QJO or executive agency or autonomous administration, it becomes SOE. Okay? So it is a corporation. That's the biggest difference between the previous forms and this SOE. Okay? They follow corporate account, and they rely on market revenue. They can issue a corporate bond. Okay? So since they have a corporate account, they have more transparency compared to previous forms of suppliers. Okay? Of course, private sector is under the risk of bankruptcy and therefore more efficient. Okay? So if your SOE is here in this stage, you can consider privatization directly. But your revenue generation function may take a form of government corporation or autonomous administration or sometimes QJO. Then you may have to transform their form to SOE first before you privatize them. Okay? The Korea went through those footsteps. For example, Korea Telecom KT, which is a private company, used to be a state-owned enterprise. But it started from a government body. It was a government corporation. And we separated it. And then we transformed to state-owned enterprise. And then we privatized. And, as you can see here, you don't have to follow each step. You can have a jump. And Korea Railway too. It used to be within the government. And we separated it. And we corporatized it. Now it is a state-owned enterprise. It is not yet to be privatized, but we can consider privatization in the future. Okay? So the steps of reform will be as follows. If you have a state-owned enterprise in a competitive market, then you can privatize it directly. But if you have a monopolistic SOE, you'll have to bring competition first. If not, it will become a private monopolist. So it's better to bring competition first before you privatize it. Okay? If you have QJO, quasi-government organization, whose budget comes from the government, then you can make it a corporation. In other words, state-owned enterprise. Then you can consider competition and privatization. If you have a government corporation in a ministry, then separation is the first thing you need to do. And then corporatize it, and then privatization. Okay? So it all depends where you are now. Okay? If you are dealing with the state-owned enterprise, you can consider privatization or competition. Which should come first? That's something I will talk later. Okay? Well, this is how we transform ministry to autonomous administration, but I'm not going to spend much time in this. Okay? So it used to be one ministry. They have a police function and telephone service function together, and it was separated to ministry and separate administration dealing with the service function. And of course, this autonomous administration finally turned into a state-owned enterprise. Okay? And autonomous administration can be transformed to executive agency. Well, these two are very similar with a little difference. Well, executive agency started in UK as a name of Next Step. But these two are very similar, and I don't think I will have to explain much about it. And this executive agency can turn into a public institution, which include quasi-government organization and state-owned enterprise. Okay? Let me tell you the difference between these two here. This QJO rely on rely on the government budget, whereas state-owned enterprise rely on their revenue from the market. That's the biggest difference between these two. They rely on budget from the government, but the SOE rely on the revenue from the market. Okay, but by legal entity, they are not part of the government. Okay, but they are not in the private sector, of course not. But they are something in the middle, in between government and the private sector. Okay. This is the example of the shift from the government body to SOE and QJO, where Korea Railway Corporation, which is a state-owned enterprise, and also we have a Korea National Railway. They are the one who construct the railway. They are infrastructure builder. And the Railway Corporation is the operator of railway. Now we separated these two functions, infrastructure and operation. Okay? But they used to be together. They used to be the autonomous administration, and we separated the autonomous administration into two. One as a state-owned enterprise, the other as a quasi-government organization. Okay? This is what we are now in Korea. Okay? The next issue is whether you have to privatize first or bring competition first. Okay? If you privatize first, of course, it will bring more competition. However, there is a risk of private monopoly. So in general, it's better to invite competition first. And it is a good preparation process for privatization. However, if you bring competition first, privatization can be delayed. Okay? So after bringing competition, it's good to reduce the time waiting period before you finally privatize your SOE. Well, of course, there are ways to bring privatization and competition at the same time. That's a splitting your SOE. If you split your SOE and privatize them at the same time, you can bring competition and privatization at the same time. Okay? Your SOE can be divided into these four different groups based on two dimensions. One dimension is network industry versus non-network industry. The other is when you have some competition already, and the other is when you have a monopoly. Okay? And these three cases can allow privatization right away. However, in this case, where you have a monopoly in a network industry, this is a monopoly in a network industry, such as railway, electricity in Korea, the privatization process should be gradual. You will have to adopt phased privatization because you will have to introduce competition first. Okay? So bring competition and try to restructure the industry as a whole, and then you finally privatize them. So that's why network industry takes a lot of time to before they finally being privatized. Okay? Of course, you also need regulatory body when you deal with this network industry's privatization. Okay? Well, that is it for the first half of this session, and I will see you soon after the little break. Thank you very much.